Welcome everyone to the June Patch Tuesday webinar. Thank you for joining us again. For those of you who are regulars, I do see a lot of names from a lot of different groups of people that we see regularly. So thank you once again for joining us, and hope that we bring you the same level of information we always do. For those of you who are new to the webinar, welcome. And a couple of things about the platform that you're in right now. This is the On24 platform. You're going to see a couple of things as we go through. One of them is the slides, which you see up on the screen right now. Shortly here, we're going to be going into a little bit of screen sharing as I go through some of the recent news, some of the cybersecurity things going on, things to be aware of. As we do that, you can make your screen share the active screen. There's basically when you hover over the window to your right, the media player, there's a box with an arrow facing left. When you click that, it becomes the dominant screen kind of very quickly, makes it easy to flip back and forth. So we'll flip back and forth here a couple times, and then we'll stay mostly on the slides for the rest of the presentation. If you have questions, please do throw those into the Q&A section. We've got a team of people who are here helping to answer as many questions as possible as we get throughout the webinar. And Todd and I will take a few of those questions live throughout, and potentially towards the end, try to recap some of the questions we feel are going to be broader kind of impact. And last, there is the media download section. There's going to be a PDF of today's presentation available in there. You can download that. It'll have the links to everything we're going to be talking about here as well if you want to follow along. If you grab it from there, you'll have it for any additional purposes you might need as well. If you don't grab it there, don't fret. We're going to be sending that out to you later today, most likely when the webinar presentation is available live on demand. That'll be going up to the website, and then a notification will go out to everybody with both links to that and other information on the Patch Tuesday page on Ivanti.com. All right, with that, we're going to move ahead. June 24, Patch Tuesday. We've got a little bit of news lineup. We're going to go through the bulletins and releases. Todd will walk us through, talk about known issues and other things that you may want to know about each of the updates. We'll also talk about what we refer to as between the Patch Tuesdays. Patch Tuesday is kind of one of the few regularly reoccurring patch release events that are still out there. Microsoft, Adobe, Oracle, there's only a few that really have a consistent time that they release. Most vendors are in more of a continuous release model. So Apple is going to release as soon as they're ready, and those updates will go out kind of on a not set time frame, but they typically release a round of updates for things like the OS, especially at least once a month on average. Sometimes a little bit longer of a cycle, maybe up to 5 or 6 weeks, but that's typically how they do that there. There is, other vendors like Google Chrome. They basically since August last year have said that they're going to do a continuous kind of once a week security update. So expect things like browsers to be more of a once a week, Chrome and Edge pretty much consistently once a week, Firefox probably 2 to 3 times a month. But that's a lot of those things are what are happening in between those. We recap a lot of that kind of in between discussion. All right, for this month, we did get the Chrome release a little bit later in the day. So depending on what, if you look at my blog post, that was out before the Google update dropped, but we did get that in the tail end of some of our other content. So you'll see that in there. But Google Chrome did release an update with 18 new CVEs. And if you look at their release notes, they do talk about 21 security fixes. From what Todd and I were gathering, 3 of them sound like they were internal fixes that did not get disclosed through a private disclosure or anything like that. So there was no CVE opened on them, but 18 CVEs for sure. The Microsoft updates, we've got 5 updates that we'll be talking about: Office and the OS, of course, and a couple of other things that we'll be talking about release-wise there. And then Mozilla did release their Firefox and Firefox ESR updates yesterday as well. Before we jump into the releases, though, we'll talk a little bit about some of the recent news. For those of you keeping tabs on Windows 11 24H2, it is in early preview, but it did get pulled. So that is actually on pause at the moment. The discussions at the moment, by the way, I'm going to jump over to screen share here. So for those of you not familiar with this, just be prepared to switch your windows there that you'll be looking at. And here we go. Got to get my correct screen up here first. It makes it a lot easier or a lot more difficult when I'm trying to share from a single screen without having too much information. So I apologize for that. Give me 1 second. There we go. Todd, are you seeing my screen?
Yep, I see it now.
Excellent. All right. So if you look at the first link in the news section this month, Windows 11 version 24H2 was released to the preview channel, but they did do some updates here. Not much as far as like details as to why, but basically they said that they were temporarily pausing the rollout of Windows 11 version 24H2 to the release preview channel. They'll resume rollout in the coming weeks. Todd and I did a little bit of digging, not much else out there. Nobody really knows the specifics as to why they paused the release, but they have paused it for the time being. So there's more details about the Windows 11 24H2 release, and you can find more details here in this link. The other thing that we believe a lot of you are going to have some interest in is recall. So we've also provided a link to this article here, which is how to manage recall. So if you're not familiar, this is the AI feature that's being introduced with Windows 11 24H2. This is giving people the ability to go and recall some very specific things like, hey, I want to know, one of the examples that cracks me up still that I heard was, I want to know what was the cat picture I was looking at a few weeks ago. And basically it has the ability to go and recall what you were browsing to, what that image was, and bring all that back and recall it for you so you can find things more easily. So basically like a broader assistant that helps you to find and recall different things that you might have been doing in the past. Well, in the privacy and security side of the conversation, this presents a lot of concerns. With that, what else can I recall? Hey, I want to know everything about this particular company that was discussed from the person on this machine. Could that pull up sensitive information about clients that you may have been working with? Could there be proprietary information that was captured within that? Where is that information hosted? These are all kind of that expanding discussion that's happening around this. So this Manage Recall article goes through the details of recall, what's required to be able to run it. You need to have a machine that supports Copilot Plus. You need 16 gig of RAM, 8 logical processors, 250 gig of storage space. And to enable it, you need at least 50 gig of free space. Snapshot capture automatically pauses once the device has less than 25 gig of space left. So at least they've made it so it won't continue to consume until the machine goes, completely out of resources. Talks about supported browsers. Oh, hey, here we go. This is the part that you really care about. Many of you are going to be concerned about, how do I turn off the ability to save those snapshots for Windows? So if snapshots were previously saved on a device, they will be deleted when this policy is enabled. So if you did have some systems that were already pushed out with the preview that had launched initially, turning this on will disable the feature, and it will also delete the current saved snapshots on the device. The following policy allows you to disable analysis of user content. So that's some of the things that people are already starting to ask about in some of the tech forums and water cooler discussions happening around in places like that. There are some limitations to this. Recall captures snapshots that include in private windows blocked apps and blocked websites. If recall gets launched or the now option is selected, then the snapshot is taken even when in private windows, blocked apps and blocked websites are displayed. It does not save those snapshots though. So again, it's taking a snapshot. It's not saving that snapshot, but what exactly is happening, within that, there's obviously a gap there where there's concerns. The user does have some options to control certain levels of things as well. They can go in and delete all snapshots or snapshots within a specific time frame as well. There's more details about everything here. We won't go through everything, but the biggest one that, again, I think this audience will be interested in is this ability to configure policies for recall. All right, so the next topic that I wanted to touch on was Windows 10 version 21H2. This is the end of updates for this edition. So end of life for this particular branch. Let's see here. Yeah, so here's the details about this June 11th being the last security update for this particular, the 21H2 branch of Windows 10. So make sure any of those devices that are still around in your environment are moving forward. All right, so jumping into some broader news, there is a little bit of a increased discussion around vulnerabilities that were found in NVIDIA and ARM chipsets. So there's an urge for customers to patch these particular vulnerabilities that were discovered. So details are available in here. There will be potentially some time here for everything to roll out and be available to update drivers, firmware updates, potentially in OS level updates for different devices and things as well. But that's the CVE here, 2024-0090. And there were additional 10 overall new high and medium severity vulnerabilities in the NVIDIA GPU. Let's see here, the ARM one. That they announced that they have an actively exploited 0-day in the Mali GPU kernel. So that's the other one that is definitely one to note here, because this one is actively being targeted. So that's 2024-4610. So that article will give you a little bit of detail there, has a couple of links to advisories and more details from each of the vendors. There's definitely other news articles about that. This is the one that covered both, so that's the one I chose for today, just to give you a simple way to get to the additional information on one or both vendors if you have them. This next article, there's definitely a few different variations of this as well, but it's talking about how researchers at the University of Illinois had developed AI agents that can autonomously hack websites and find 0-day vulnerabilities. So this is, again, the power of augmenting with AI to be able to do activities faster. If we can train an AI on the ways that somebody would investigate and potentially try to find a vulnerability to take advantage of, that AI can sit there and basically just continue to do that on a regular basis. So this is definitely going to be kind of the future of what we're dealing with. We're going to be dealing with threat actors who are setting up these types of AI agents to be able to investigate and find vulnerabilities that they can take advantage of, and potentially even write the basics of, the exploits that may be used. We've seen generative AI already being used for code development as well, code generation. So it's not a huge stretch to say, hey, find this, figure out a basic way to take advantage of it, give me the information, and then from there, they will continue the process of further weaponizing it to their purpose. So this is just accelerating the threat actor side of how quickly vulnerabilities will be discovered and targeted. For our purposes, we just need to be able to counter that with the ability to respond faster. So this is one of the things that For those of you who may have been at some of our recent events, like our Texas customer-facing event that we had a little over a month ago now, I talked a lot about how we need to get to the point where we no longer just have regular maintenance. All of you are here today for Patch Tuesday to kick off and to start the process of your regular maintenance for each month, but that's no longer enough to really keep up with today's types of threats. We need that regular maintenance still, but we also need additional tracks of work that are happening more continuously. Now, ideally, we get these to the additional tracks to be less disruptive if possible, not require a reboot, things like that. The OS update each month, doesn't matter what OS you're on, save maybe Linux, there are some ways to update things like the Linux kernel without a reboot. TuxCare, those of you who've heard me talk about TuxCare before, they do a live patching approach that works like that for the Linux platform. For Windows and Mac, though, you really can't take that type of approach very easily. When you do, you enter into an area where it's your support for that device is in question, because you're talking about things like microcode patching and things like that at that point, which is not being done by Apple or Microsoft. It's being done by a third party, and who actually is, it's going outside of the bounds of what that machine is basically certified to be from the vendor. So we have to get to the point where we can still do that once a month reboot for things like the OS update, but browser updates for things like my teleconference applications. If I need to update Zoom, if I need to update WebEx, if I need to update a lot of those types of user applications that are easily targeted and have more of a continuous stream of updates they're going to release whenever they need to. We can set up a priority track of work that can happen more frequently, maybe once a week or twice a week. And those updates can be pushed out without the need to reboot. Things like 0 days. We can't wait and do a drawn out 0-day response bucket. In fact, one of the customers, one of the companies that we talked to when down in Texas when we were at that customer event, said that their target SLA for 0-day remediation is 4 hours from release from the vendor. That's their target. Now, their actual SLA might be something like 24 hours, but their target is to try to do it in as little as 4 hours. So that's something we want to try to enable. We want to make it so that as soon as that update's available, Google Chrome had 3 0 days in a week and a half this last month. And in that time frame, many of you had to try to go and push out those updates very quickly to try to resolve that. If you're trying to get that pushed out and you're trying to burn that down in as little as 4 to 8 hours, you need a predefined, agreed upon approach to do that, and you need to have controls in place to try to minimize the the type of occurrence of those types of things, but also to be able to react to it very quickly and to make sure that you can respond to those quickly. So really, we're talking about 3, one regularly scheduled but 2 continuous tracks of work that potentially we need to be able to manage in parallel. So that's the type of thinking that we need to get into. How do we modernize our approach to make it more responsive to the way that threats are coming at us? So that's definitely the way that we are thinking towards how do we better solve these problems for organizations and help you to respond as fast as these threat actors are able to respond. So just some interesting news there on how this is developing. AI, again, it's not a bad thing in itself. It's just a development in technology. How we use it, well, there's going to be people who are going to use it for good purpose and people that will use it for bad purposes. This is just an example of how it speeds up those threat actors and their ability to do that. So our understanding of what they're doing helps us to try to respond in kind. TikTok. This may be something that some of you have had discussions about. There's a number of different activities going on there. Some zero-click vulnerability activity that was going on. Even CNN got hit by this one, but CNN, Paris Hilton, a few other notables accounts within TikTok got taken over by a zero-click vulnerability within TikTok. So that's definitely something that is causing a lot of stir within that community. There's a couple of things that are kind of guidance-wise recommended for this, being able to do things like make sure your phone's up to date from an update perspective, make sure your apps are up to date, and making sure that you're able to keep kind of pushing those types of updates forward. So if you don't have an MDM, managing those types of things for users' devices that you're running corporate data on, that's one of the reasons why it is so important, is making sure that you can control and push users to do those types of updates. So this article kind of talks a little bit about the zero-day vulnerability and a little bit of the news around that. Getting into the Linux vulnerabilities, I'm going to stop my screen share for a moment here. There we go. So back over to the slides. There is the one Microsoft public disclosure this month is this NSEC 3 closest enclosure proof can exhaust CPU vulnerability. It's kind of a mouthful. Basically, it's a vulnerability in the DNS protocol that can allow an attacker to send a DNSSEC request, and if done correctly, they can basically spike the CPU on that DNS service and basically make perform a DOS attack. MITRE released the information about this earlier this year. If you go and look up news around this particular vulnerability, you'll see that back in late February and into March, a number of different vendors from F5 to Cisco to many of the Linux distros out there, especially those that are highly used as web servers, were getting this update earlier this year. Microsoft has that included in this month's OS update. So you could see the additions, the Server 2012, 2012 R2, 2016, 2019, and Server 2022 are affected by this. There is some mitigating circumstances that, I mean, obviously if the DNS service is in use, you're going to have the risk of exploitation on this particular vulnerability. There's no active exploitation. This is just a disclosure, but it does mean enough information's been released to the public where an attacker may be able to take advantage of that. The Linux side, there were a couple of vulnerabilities that we are looking at out there. This is again from our partner over at TuxCare. They're kind of showcasing a couple of the big ones that people are needing to focus on. The first one here, CVE 2024-32002. This is a vulnerability in Git that could allow a remote code execution when cloning repositories with submodules. So if you're familiar with managing repositories in your Linux environment, if you've ever tried to clone one of those, this is where the danger sets in for this particular vulnerability. So 2024-32002 and others, while vulnerabilities were fixed, then that allowed, basically prevented these particular security exploits from being taken advantage of with Git repositories. So it does, let's see here, trying to see if I had the specifics around fixes and security updates. The vulnerabilities have been patched in Git version 2.45.1. There's a whole bunch of versions here, but 2.44.1, there's a number of, if you do a search for that CVE, there's a few articles out there that kind of list out the different versions that were affected and updates that have occurred. So, but that's one of the ones that you'll want to make sure you're getting updated across your Linux environment. The next one, they did have a special note there, of course, also never clone untrusted repositories. If you aren't sure of the source of that repository, like most things, don't trust anything unless you've got a way to validate it's one, a source from a trusted vendor, and two, that it's being properly maintained. Many of these could be open source projects. If it's a project that's not getting contributions very frequently or very limited contributions from a very small set of people, that increases the risk of potential things being introduced through that. The next CVE that was brought up is CVE 2024-0646, CVSS score of 7.8. It's a vulnerability in the TLS subsystem in the Linux kernel where it does not properly handle splice messages. So in this case, updating the kernel is the method to make sure that you've got that resolved. Again, if you look at this, there may have been updates available for some time, but in the Linux world, each of these distros may update at different periods of time. So this one, they're basically just kind of reminding people to continue to get this one resolved. It was actually, you may have seen updates available for this as early as back in March this year, I believe. Many of these started to be released. So again, just make sure you've checked and have your Linux kernels being updated to versions that are no longer vulnerable for this one. The third one for this month is definitely one that you'll want to double check on. First covered back in April, but it's kind of resurfacing again because it has been added to CISA's known exploited vulnerabilities list. Malicious threat actors are looking for it, and you should be too. Make sure that you've got this resolved. It lists out the affected kernels there, so kernel 3.1.5 to 6.8 RC1, and distros like RHEL, Debian, Ubuntu, and their other derivatives. So pretty broad impact on that one. And it has gotten attention high enough to get added to the CISA KEV list. So again, just make sure that you're looking for these 3 CVEs within your Linux environments and make sure that you get those resolved. All right. So most of you may not be responsible for this side of the house, but it's always good to make sure that we're keeping an eye on the other vulnerabilities that were resolved. There were a number of services, modules, and development libraries that had vulnerabilities resolved this month from Microsoft. Azure Data Science Virtual Machines for Linux, Azure File Sync, Azure Identity Libraries, Azure Storage Movement Client Library, Azure Monitoring Agent. Each of those are different parts of the Azure stack that did get updates to resolve security vulnerabilities this month. One of the challenges there is these many times are not a software update. They're going to be things like going and changing a configuration or something along those lines. Or if they do have an update available, you have to go to that specific interface within Azure, potentially do a few steps, and then update that particular component. Typically there's going to be steps in each of these, but the key thing that we want to make sure people are aware of is that these vulnerabilities do exist, and they're things that you want to make sure are communicated to your operations teams to go and update those particular areas. Microsoft's authentication library for .NET, Java, Node.js, and Python did have some vulnerabilities resolved as well. And so your development teams, if they're using that MSAL, they will have some updates potentially needing to be rolled out there. And then updates for all 3 branches of Visual Studio. So your development teams will want to take a look at those particular development platform and library updates and make sure that they're getting those rolled out. We did talk about the Windows 10 21H2 end of life. That was this was the last security update this month for that particular branch. So make sure that that is getting removed from your environments. Looking out further, we've got a few months until the next lifecycle events. So Windows 11 Home and Pro, you could see the 22H2 coming up on 10.8, and then Windows 11 Enterprise and Education, same for 21H2 there. So 22H2 on the Home and Pro, 21H2 for the Enterprise and EDU Windows 11 editions. So seems like a ways off yet, but summer's going to go quick, and that date will be upon us faster than most people are expecting. So just make sure you're taking a look now for how many you've got and making sure to plan accordingly to make sure those are rolled forward. no upcoming immediate events on the long-term service channel support. All right, Todd, go ahead and take us into the bulletins and releases.
Okay, Chris, before I dig into that, I'd like to address something that came up in the questions. There are a couple of them around this. So you might have heard and might have been involved in the fact that Microsoft pulled and reissued and pulled again the Server 2019 patches from last Patch Tuesday. That particular KB is 5037765. The only thing they stated is that there were some issues around their interaction with the English service packs when that happened. And they eventually released an out-of-band patch later in May. I think it was around the 24th or so. It was 5039705. And there were some questions around that particular patch because even though they issued that, there were still some additional issues showing up in the forums. And from what I've seen, they seem to be related to, they've traced it down to the size of the reserve partition. There were some issues with that. Now, I don't know if that was ever resolved. I didn't see any final kind of rulings on that, but let's be aware of that if you ran into it last month. And let's see kind of what happens with the new updates that they released this month. So on that note, let's kind of dig into what we saw this month. Starting with the third-party stuff, Chris had mentioned that there was a Google Chrome update, dropped late in the day around 3 o'clock Central Time, our time when we first saw that. It is version 126, ending with the .5657 there for Windows and Mac. As Chris mentioned, 18 reported vulnerabilities, although they said there were 21 fixes, security fixes in that particular release. But note that 9 of those were rated as high, so obviously an important patch for those of you out there using Chrome on a regular basis. Chris also mentioned in the intro there that we had updates for Firefox that came out early in the day yesterday. Firefox 127 fixed 15 vulnerabilities. They had 4 issues that were rated as high there, and of course their long-term service channel version 115.12 came out and addressed 8 vulnerabilities, 3 of which were rated as high there. So again, lots of stuff in the browser world happening yesterday, as well as, of course, Microsoft Edge came out with its Chromium updates as well. Moving into the actual bulletins, if you will, that were released. We, of course, had our regular Windows 11 update. Separate releases for 21H2, and then the combined 22H2, 23H2 came out. 28 vulnerabilities in all addressed there. The publicly disclosed vulnerability that Chris talked about earlier was not part of the Windows 11 update. It was part of Windows 10. See that here on the next slide. There is one open issue, which is kind of funny. I talked about this last month. I thought it was interesting that Microsoft pulled this up, that there is an issue with your profile picture. If you upgrade, you might not be able to change your profile picture, so be aware of that one. Interestingly enough, they fixed it in the latest versions. At least they didn't call it out in 22H2 and 23H2, but they did still list it for 21H2. So just calling it out here for everybody. You want to make sure you're aware of it. The Windows 10 update, again, a little bit larger, fixed 33 vulnerabilities. That MITRE denial of service vulnerability Chris talked about. Note that it is a 2023 vulnerability. So it's been around for a while, but it hasn't been publicly disclosed at this point. So they called it up 5868. Again, Chris talked in quite a bit of detail earlier about this particular vulnerability. Also of note, I think this has come up a couple of times. People were asking us in the chat session about curl. Microsoft did finally update curl.exe in both the Windows 11 and Windows 10 versions of the operating system, and is now 8.7.1. So those of you who are worried about those earlier reported curl vulnerabilities, they should now be addressed in the latest version with this month's updates. So be aware of that one as well. Same issues that we saw last month were carried forward to this month as well. We've talked about Copilot and the icon display issues. Again, they're dropping these versions now, so these particular problems will probably they don't appear in newer versions of Windows 10. There is an issue with the way some of the Microsoft connected cache nodes are working. So there's an issue around that one, and also be aware of the profile picture also here on Windows 10 as well. So again, we've been carrying these forward for quite a few months now. So I'm guessing they're going to go away because we end of life this operating system. And Windows Server 2022 also had the profile picture issue. They reported that this month. Moving on, again, the first two, Windows 10 and Windows 11, were critical updates because of the critical vulnerability in those. SharePoint Server was only rated as important this month. We did, of course, see the usual 3 upgrades for Subscription Edition, Server 2016, and SharePoint Server 2019 as well. 3 separate KB articles on those. You can go in and take a look at them if you want. There was one vulnerability, 2024 30100, which was a remote code execution vulnerability. Again, it's not a exploited or publicly disclosed one. So again, only a single vulnerability addressed this month on SharePoint Server. We did see a few more updates on Office. Again, Office 2016, the current on-premise standalone version that's supported, not the click-to-run version. It was the vulnerabilities were all related to Outlook, by the way. You can go in and read about each one of those. I have them listed here: 300, 101, 103, and 104 in the case of Outlook 2016. They are remote code execution vulnerabilities, and they can be exploited via the preview pane. They did call that out in the vulnerabilities themselves. However, these look like pretty complex vulnerabilities to exploit. It says there's a lot of things that have to happen in order for a user to exploit these. So, but again, rated important. 3 vulnerabilities addressed, like I said, in the Office versions, in the SaaS click-to-run versions, of which include Microsoft 365, Office 2019, and Office Long-Term Service Channel 2021. 4 vulnerabilities addressed. The additional one there is the 300-102, shown on the list down below. Again, none of these are known, exploited, or publicly disclosed, hence the reason the update this month is only rated as important. Chris talked quite a bit about between the Patch Tuesdays and kind of us tracking what's going on. We break them up into 3 categories. We have security updates with CVEs. Again, this is where the vendors choose to report what particular vulnerabilities from the vulnerability database they've addressed. We know that there are a lot of times that the vendors will call out, this is a security update, but they don't particularly call out the CVEs that they've addressed, or there are maybe no open CVEs that have been logged against these particular applications. But in our content catalog, we flag them as security updates. And then we have the non-security updates, which are either performance enhancements, new features, etc., but they don't specifically say that there were any security updates. Chris did mention that there were quite a few versions of Chrome released in the last month. There were 3 of them that were released here with CVE information. You can see that they're releasing on a regular basis, as Chris said. The first one was from May 22nd, a quick release on a new CVE on the 23rd of May. And then finally on the 30th, they released one with addressing 7 CVEs. And of course, we had the recent update yesterday as well, of course. We saw some additional updates with CVE information for Docker. The Foxit family of PDF managers, the editor, subscription version, and reader version, all had the same set of vulnerabilities addressed as well. And then, of course, we saw in the Opera Suite, the single vulnerability address there. There was an update for Python, for those of you who use that in your environment. And finally, 4 vulnerabilities in VM Workstation Player 17.5.2 this particular month. On the Apple side, we saw updates for Google Chrome and Microsoft Edge, of course, closely related, as we know, because of the Chromium relationship. We saw a few security updates as well for Firefox, Edge, and Parallels, and then a whole handful of non-security updates as well. Again, calling out the versions of Chrome with the CVEs here. We have, you'll notice these are the same basic releases as came out for the Windows side, same vulnerabilities addressed. And then, of course, on the Edge side, we saw 3 updates as well throughout the month, as well as the one that came out yesterday. So that's kind of the activity this month between the Patch Tuesdays. Chris, what are you seeing in the question and answer side?
Well, I think we have a couple of ones that are fully expected. There was a couple of people asking questions about the Server 2019 out of band. So maybe we just double check that we've got that covered. There was one of last month's updates for Server 2019. The OS update was pulled the Friday after Patch Tuesday. It was only the 2019 that was pulled, and then it was re-released as an out of band, and there have been some reports of continued issues for some of those even after the out of band. So if you were affected by the initial issues, approach the out of band with caution, and this month's update with caution too, just to make sure everything's been resolved. But there were a couple of questions about that. Recall. Several people asked about different variations of how do you manage in a case of like BYOD, how do you manage in different scenarios like that. It's still fairly early on in the preview, so as we go through the next couple of months here, I fully expect patchmanagement.org will probably have a significant thread about it. Ask Woody may be a good place to go and monitor for some guidance around how to approach that. There'll be some specific ways that people will approach doing that. I've already pinged, for those of you who know Robin Rowe, he's our counterpart on the Ivanti Neurons product area where we do our bots and automation. So even doing something like that where it may not be a system that you could update GPO or use CSPs on it, but maybe you can run configuration changes through a scripting type method like that and do so through something like a Neurons bot. So with our agent on there, you'd be able to then modify the configuration. So there should be a lot of ways developing over the next couple of months in how to approach that. I expect this will be a hot topic. So we'll definitely try to keep people up to date with some of that as it develops. And then there was a question around, a couple of questions around how to do that approach for 0-day and priority update response that I mentioned before. So for those of you using some of our on-prem products like security controls, doing a agent policy, you can actually create multiple tasks in there. So you could have a regular maintenance task, which is your PatchTuesday plus X type scheduling option. You could have a priority updates task that's more of a weekly activity where you may specifically filter down to say only these specific applications. So maybe you want to focus on the browsers. Only Chrome, Edge, and Firefox get updated in that task, and that task only runs once a week or twice a week on Tuesdays and Thursdays, however you want to configure that. And then the 0-day one would use something like a patch group, and you'd have a task that would run daily. Only if there's something in that patch group would that task ever do anything. So you could do a combination of tasks like that in security controls. For those of you on EPM, using either a rollout project or patch automation workflow, you can do the regular maintenance using that configuration, and autofix can be that kind of catch-all for the additional things like 0-day response. So you can configure that same task with autofix. That's intended to be the cleanup for machines that didn't get caught in your regular maintenance, but it can also be done to use that kind of 0-day response. For those of you either looking at or already on the Ivanti Neurons patch management solution, the July release, we're going to specifically be creating a new experience around that will have 3 kind of predefined maintenance tracks. So your regular maintenance, priority updates, and 0-day response. Within each of those, you'll be able to say, yes, I want to turn on this particular task, and I want it to be configured like this. So you'll be able to go in and create those types of configurations kind of as more of a first-class experience in there. So some different options there depending on which product you're on, but we're definitely looking at how to make that type of experience more of an out-of-the-box experience within the Neurons patch management experience. So let's see here, any new questions that have come in since?
There was a question, Chris, around should I do any like major upgrades to my regular images that I use to image my boxes? And I mentioned that, for those of you who have been concerned about this curl issue that's been around for quite a while, Microsoft did finally update them this month. So it would probably be beneficial if you do update your gold images, if you want to think of it that way, with this latest update, because there was a lot of information in the news about curl being exploited. So we want to make sure that that's covered.
All right, I think that is all the questions we had so far. It was kind of a low-key Patch Tuesday, which is never really a bad thing. We didn't have as many 0 days or emergency kind of go do this right now type of events this month. But yeah, absolutely one of those things to watch out for. Again, kind of the priorities this month: if you get your OS update out there, you get the publicly disclosed vulnerability, and there was one critical CVE in the OS this month. It was a 9.8 CVSS score, and not disclosed or being targeted at this time, but if somebody were to figure that one out, it is a remote code execution over the network with no required authentication and low complexity. So particularly nasty if somebody figures out how to take advantage of it. So the biggest risk this month is your OS update. The browsers are definitely the second priority. That would be kind of our guidance here, is focus on those two areas first, and you reduce a significant amount of your risk right there. On that note, I think we are ready to wrap up. So thank you everyone for joining us, and we will talk to you next month.
Thanks, everybody. Sounds good.